true obedience. And why is that important? Well, because the definitive mark of a transformed heart is a transformed life. For as Jesus keeps on saying, a new heart can't help but to produce a new fruit. And again, we don't obey God to try and get on his good side, right? That is not how you get into heaven. That is not how you get your sins forgiven. Your salvation and your entrance into heaven will never be a function of how obedient you were or how well you could perform. That is not what I'm saying, because that is not what Jesus is teaching. Rather, your salvation is totally dependent upon the perfect obedience and perfect performance of Christ alone. But the key is that you must be found in him, right? You must be in him. Why? Because he is your righteousness. That is to say that his perfections are what must clothe you completely in the day that you stand before him. But the sign, and this is the point of the passage, but the sign that you are truly in him and abiding in him is that you now live a life that begins to look increasingly like him. That is what we mean by the word sanctification. It is the idea of growing little by little into the image of Christ. And so we come again to yet another passage in which Jesus is calling these disciples to perform a self-examination, self-analysis. He wants us constantly analyzed, constantly examining our own lives, our own faith. You say, well, that sounds exhausting. Well, not if you understand that that is the means by which you will persevere. It is true that God will bring you to the end. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Philippians chapter 1. It is God ultimately who keeps us and causes us to persevere. He is the one who brings us to the end. But what we must never forget is that God is at the same time a God of means, right? A God of means. And so Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5 these words. He says, so test yourself. That is a command. Test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Or do you not recognize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you? In other words, you will be able to see it. Unless, he says, indeed, you fail the test. That is to say that you don't see Christ in you after a test, after an examination, after an analysis. And this is not about a morbid introspection where you're trying to achieve perfection or something like that. Rather, this is a healthy tool that Christ here gives to all who would call themselves a true disciple. And why? Well, because the ability to live a life of lukewarm self-deception is so easy to slip into. And he does not want that for us. Like, notice verse 41 of this passage. Peter asks the question. He says, and Lord, are you addressing this parable to us or to everyone else as well? What is Jesus' response? Verse 42, and the Lord said, who then is the faithful and sensible steward, whom his master will put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at a proper time? In other words, again, his immediate instinct is to give yet another parable to move them towards self-examination, to examine their life yet again, so as to find out as to whether or not they are faithful and wise. And so what we have in verses 43 through 48 is Jesus describing here in this passage 4 different kinds of people. And what we should understand about this is that every single person in this room falls into one of these 4 categories, no exception. And so the implication of his words is for all of us to try and discern as to which category it is that we may belong to. That is the effect of this passage. And so all we're going to do is simply walk through these 4 descriptions, and then we'll end it, Lord willing, with a few thoughts for some personal reflection. And so again, this is going to be a very simple passage, not a lot of complexity on this one either. And so just to give it to you from the outset, in verses 43 through 44, we will first of all see the blessed, 43 through 44. In 45 through 46, we'll see the butchered. And then in verses 47 through 48, we'll see the beaten. This is a very violent passage this morning. The blessed, the butchered, and the beaten. And that final category of the beaten is then broken into 2 further categories. And that is in verse 47, we'll see the severely beaten. And then in 48, we'll see the less severely beaten. In fact, this is where Jesus begins to make some important distinctions and separations fact, I almost entitled this sermon simply Degrees of Faithfulness, because that is exactly what this passage is teaching. Jesus is now going to make a distinction not merely between those who believe and those who might not believe. Rather, what he is also doing is making a very important distinction among those who are faithful and then those who are perhaps less faithful. This is not merely about those who are saved and those who are not. Rather, he is very concerned, deeply concerned with the degree of faithfulness among those who are saved, among those who are true. Holiness, in other words. And the point in context is that your degree of faithfulness is inextricably tied to the level of your conviction regarding the imminency of Christ's return. The truth is that there are degrees of faithfulness and degrees of unfaithfulness. And that is something true, by the way, both corporately and individually within the church. There are more faithful churches and less faithful churches. There are more pure churches and less pure churches. Well, in the same way, there are more faithful Christians and less faithful Christians. There are more obedient Christians and less obedient Christians. And he is concerned that we be among the more faithful. That is the issue of this text. And so that is what Jesus here will now reveal this morning, but again, for the sake of self-examination. And so let's look, first of all, at this first category, which is verses 43 through 44. And this is what I am simply calling the blessed. This is the blessed. And so notice again what he says. Jesus states, "And blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions." Now, what I want you to notice is, again, this important connection between a true faith or a true belief and then a life of obedience. That is the essential theme of this passage. In fact, there are many who tend to separate the necessity of a true obedience from a true faith. That is very prevalent and ubiquitous in our day. And again, I understand the desire to not inadvertently communicate that a person is somehow saved by their obedience. That is the essence of false religion. We have seen that through and through, even throughout the Gospel of Luke. And all false religion is damning. We know that. A person has never merited salvation based upon anything that they can do. Let me just make that abundantly clear. It is not what I'm saying. That was the great problem of the Pharisees, that in no uncertain terms condemned them. They were a proud, very proud group of spiritual people who were depending upon their own religiosity and ability to adhere to Mosaic law, but as the grounds then upon which they were somehow made righteous. They thought that if they could obey enough, or long enough, or hard enough, or strict enough, or consistently enough, then that would then somehow secure, but then also maintain their righteous status. But that is not how salvation comes. That is not how a person is made righteous or put into a right standing before the righteous eyes of a holy and righteous God. Rather, a person is saved or declared righteous by faith alone or trust alone in what Christ, the only righteous one, has done on their behalf. That is so critical to understand, because that is the essence of the gospel. In fact, that is what makes it such good news and gives to a person hope. If this thing were in any way dependent upon us, we are lost. We cannot do this. For all have sinned and fall short, present tense, always, consistently, of the glory of God. We have no ability within us to achieve righteousness. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, "For he, the Father, made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf." Why? Why did he have to do that? What was the purpose? So that, here's the result, we might become the righteousness of God in him.
You've been listening to Word of the Vine with Pastor Matt Miller. Pastor Matt has been diving into the book of Luke, and there are so many interesting things to learn from this gospel. You get some insights into God's humanity as he came to earth as a human. Jesus faced all kinds of trials and hardships that this world offered him. Isn't it great to realize that Jesus encountered similar situations as you and me? In fact, this is why Jesus is called our sympathetic high priest. He is able to meet us in our greatest needs because he understands the experience of what it means to be human. He understands what it means to live in a broken, fallen world. But most importantly, he also offers the solution to it. If you'd like to hear this message or any others from this series in Luke, we invite you to go to thevinemke.org. If you like what you're hearing, It would be so great to meet you in person. We have a weekly service on Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. So, if you're in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, come join us this Sunday. You'll get the opportunity to hear more messages like this one from Pastor Matt. Something else that might interest you is that we have live translation in Spanish during our service. Go to thevinemke.org to learn more about how to get connected and to find out about the Vine Community Church. If you'd like to get in touch with us over the phone, you can do that too. Our number is 414-301-9312. That's 414-301-9312. That's all for today.